interesting because as the Tasmanian budget papers show and as the federal budget papers show, the economy is supposed to slow down quite considerably next year. In fact, across Australia, the per capita, we're supposed to go into recession. That is, economic growth next year is supposed to be 1.5%, but the population is supposed to grow by 1.7%. And the only time, I had a look, and over the last 35 years, the only time we've had a full year where per capita GDP went backwards was during the 1990 recession. It happened 3 times, during the 1990 recession, during the global financial crisis, and during the pandemic recession. So we're looking at quite a big slowdown next year. Now, if you're expecting the economy to slow down, kind of austerity and pulling back is not the right economic thing to do, particularly if you want to protect the economy. So, despite the fact that the government is not expecting to try and expand spending, I think that, their revenue is really going to go backwards as the economy goes backwards.
Okay. And Thirza, I saw something about efficiency dividends in the public sector. That sounds like cuts to me.
It is. So you would say it's an austerity budget. I would say it's a really tired budget, which to me is austerity. Like, it's kind of harking back to the past, which we know through COVID doesn't work. So yeah, it has significant cuts. It has named up cuts in terms of the efficiency dividends, but more than that, all of the agency budgets will not increase with demand either. So they don't have any indexation, or they have limited indexation for both wage increases, but also just for non-wage costs. And we know that that's that inflation is running quite high. So there's actually stealth cuts for as well as the efficiency dividend. Which is huge, right? Because, we're talking about a growing demand, and what we've got is a budget that's not even staying still, it's going backwards. So I think it's a really bad budget for Tasmanians, and particularly for the time that we have right now. Like, people are in a cost of living crisis. They're feeling like they're already in recession, even if we're not in recession. And what they need is investment in public services. But I think the other thing I would say, it is literally, like you said, it's wide and deep. It's like they've mapped all the areas I think they might get a little bit of pushback, and they've given them just enough money. So child safety, for example, has basically doubled the number of people who are waiting to be assessed, kids, and yet they're going to get some money, but they're not going to get any money until 26, 27. The other big issue for me in this budget is it just has, the biggest risk is workforce. So we know right now that it doesn't matter where you go, it's not actually resources that's stopping the delivery of services. It's actually the lack of workers. And there's nothing in here about recruiting, training, or retaining a workforce except for teachers. So that's a big risk. And I think it's probably going to end up being where they end up getting a lot of their savings from, is we will not have workers in place. And I think most dangerous to me is it sends a really bad message to workers about coming here if you've got efficiency dividends as well, at a time when we need to be encouraging people to move to this state and to stay here.
And just to understand efficiency dividends, it's the laziest of lazy ways to cut, right? So if you wanted to cut spending as a government, what you should do is you should look at everything you do, work out the thing that's giving you the least amount of value, and target your cuts at that. An efficiency dividend cuts everything a little bit. So it cuts all the good things, all the best things, and all the bad things by a little bit. So, it's kind of the cuts that governments make when they can't be bothered to do the hard work to find out where they might actually find some savings.
And I thought our health workers were crying out to be paid better, not have things cut from there.
Yeah, they've made a commitment that no frontline will be impacted, but I think we learned from the COVID that it's not a frontline and a backline, it's a team. And actually it's a confused budget, because on one hand we've invested in teachers, and we've actually invested in additional support for teachers in recognition that they're doing too much admin. And then we're going to have an efficiency dividend cutting the back line. So, that work doesn't go anywhere. It just gets put onto the front line. So it's a really bad, so then how you're actually allocating your resources is inefficient. There's no doubt that there's efficiencies to be gained in the public sector, but they actually need investment. It's about IT, and it's about new processes and updating and modernising. And there's no money for any of that. Money that was there previously is not there this time.
Wow, okay. Environment, how did it go? I know I looked up one item.
Got your report.
The State of the Environment report, which we've been trying to have reinstated for some time now. The Australia Institute's been working hard on that. Legally required every 5 years, but not seen since 2009. Has 400,000 attached to it in the budget, and 191,000 of that is to be paid to the person organising it, which is almost half the full amount. So apparently 6 chapters are going to be written by consultants with $200,000. But anyway, in a year, with 15 years worth of data to collate and analyse. So any comments on that or environment? I looked at climate as well.
Yeah, I haven't, I confess, I haven't had a chance to go deep into the environmental side. There was some funding for tourism and opening up sort of areas for tourism. But what was interesting about the infrastructure spending was almost all of it was roads. In fact, if you add up all of the investment in infrastructure spending in tourism, hospitals, law and order, schools and education, all the rest of it, it's still less than what's going into roads and bridges. So it's kind of a very Romanesque budget in many ways. Rome was known for its roads, and Rome was known for its stadiums. And this seems to kind of fit quite well. All roads lead to Hobart, and AFL games for the masses and bread.
But if you live in Tasmania, you realise that some of those roads have been promised for a really long time. You're not sure how much of it's actually new money. Look, I think it's really uninspiring around climate change. But I think, from my point of view, as the kind of leader of the public sector union, if we are serious about tackling climate change, then we need to invest in NRE, because it is literally the 2/3 of the estate is around land management, and it's the agency that manages that. But more than that, it's also the agency that increasingly manages tourism, because everyone comes to see our beautiful places. And if we don't increase its resources, and it's also it's the agency that helps protect our export industries, right? So if we don't increase the actual funding to NRE, it literally is only doing tourism work or like supporting kind of businesses and export industry. And the land management and the climate change work is getting crunched. And that's a real concern for our members, is that actually it's a lot of cleaning toilets and not enough resources to actually go out and do land management and protection. So I think that's really concerning. And it's a continuation of what we've seen from that agency for a good decade. It is the agency where we take money and give it to everyone else. It's the agency where we secured additional, so they send workers into the forest, into the wilderness, and they don't provide them with safety gear, right? Like, they have to have their own stuff. And then when we won that,
serious?
Yeah. They have to bring their own tent, backpack, whatever. And then when we won that, they sought to cut their hours to pay for it. It's an agency that has every budget capital investment, but no workers. And that's just got to change.
I'm shocked. How about I open it up to you guys for questions? Does anyone have a question? We don't have a roving mic, so please just speak up. And I should acknowledge that Meg Webb is here, independent member for Nelson. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Questions? Hopefully we can hear you, sorry.
Yeah, I'll do my best. In the past, when things have been tough for workers, they've gone on strike and demanded better pay, and that has presumably contributed to inflation. But people aren't doing that now. I wonder why the people are not reacting in a more robust way to get better deals.
Matt, do you want to?
Well, I mean, it's basically we'd spent 20, 30 years trying to undercut workers' ability to get pay rises, and we have been spectacularly successful. We have changed the rules around striking so that it's almost impossible to do. We have created casual and other precarious work models like sham contracting and things like that in order to make it so that your boss can sack you at a moment's notice if you jack up or are unwilling to accept what's offered. And we have succeeded. And what's really, really strange is the unemployment rate nationally is 3.7%, in Tasmania it's 3.9%, it's only slightly higher. Normally you would expect at this particular time that workers would have a lot of bargaining power. There aren't that many unemployed people. You would expect that wages would be racing ahead of inflation. They're not, they're about half what inflation is. And it really is the changing nature of the whole IR, the whole industrial relation landscape. And we've kind of set out to do that, and we've done that.
Yeah, I think there's lots going on here. First of all, I think because of that, it's really difficult to get wage rises. So actually the fastest way to get a wage rise right now is to change jobs. And lots of people do that. But for example, like my union, and we've just finished public sector union bargaining, and we did go on strike. And, we've got quite a long history of strike through various campaigns. But actually key things in this budget that are being now chalked up by the government as investment in health and education were things that unions had to fight for, like additional in-class support and additional teacher recruitment and a whole range of health measures as well. So the reality is also that I think public sector workers are now at the point where quite often they're using their bargaining power to actually get investment in the public sector because they know deeply how much we are unable to meet demand and the cost on the community of that. And they make that decision about what's more important to them, and often it is investment. So I think that's problematic, but they're definitely the scourge of insecure work. Like to go back to your example, or my NRE, my favourite, I regularly call them the worst employer in the state service. There's people employed in NRE on 50-hour contracts a year. So on
Like an hour a week.
Yeah, permanent on 50 hours a year, regularly working full time, and then so they're that's difficult to go on strike.
Can you just explain what you mean by that a bit more?
So they are given a contract. Sometimes it's fixed term, so it's not permanent. Sometimes it's permanent, and they're guaranteed 1 hour, basically 50 hours a year, which is less than 1 hour a week. And then they can be flexed up and flexed down according to need. But during COVID, there was a question about, well, what am I actually going to be paid? Because legally, they only have to be paid 50 hours a year. And so we had to get a guarantee that they wouldn't have that they would be paid what they would usually be paid. But that means that workers are in a really precarious position and it's difficult to take action. So we need to see that, and that also means that these are workers who live in regional communities, who historically would have held regional communities, public sector jobs in regional communities are, I think, like the roots of the community, right? Like they're supposed to be jobs that are there across the seasons, holding the community together when the tourism changes, and they're not like that anymore. They're seasonal in their own, and they're insecure. So I think there's many reasons, but it's a problem.
Go ahead.
Just clarify what NRE is.
Oh, sorry. Used to be Dipipui, now Natural Resource Environment Tasmania. So responsible for parks, land management, biosecurity, EPA,
Primary industries.
It's
a massive department.
So just to follow up on that, Thirza, do other states have similar contracts in place for
No, I think it's a Tassie special.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Who'd like to go next? Go ahead.
The government's planning a really significant reform of local government. Someone once said reform costs a lot of money. Did the government allocate any, perhaps $100 million to deal with the process of trying to reduce councils and pay for the major admin costs that they would probably insure in this budget? They're planning to do it effectively this year. Did you see it in the budget?
I haven't seen it in the budget, but I only had 2.5 hours and probably wasn't what I was looking for.
No, I didn't see it either.
yeah, what it'll be interesting to see, because there's definitely, we've got a state service review, well, there was a review 2 years ago, and there's no money in the budget for any of the recommendations out of that.
I'll have another look tomorrow.
Similar question. Because I was wondering if there was anything in there for emergency services or responses to, we've come out of El Nino into El Nino, or I get them mixed up, but like we're probably going to have fires over the next 12 to 24 months. What's in the budget for extra firefighters, rapid response to these areas?
There is money in NRE for firefighters. There's also some money for winching as well, which is, I think, a growing part of our firefighter response. There's also quite a lot of money for flood, kind of following the flood. But again, from what I can see and from memory, it's project-based money. Like it's not, and the feedback from our members is they don't need more projects. Like more projects have more project leaders. They have more, what they actually need is more base funding, just to go out and do the work. So yeah, a lot of it is project-based and not ongoing, from what I can remember.
Yeah, it seems to be a feature of this budget, and for some time, is the idea that they can pull the funding very quickly. And so if you just stick it in projects, then you can pull it. But what you actually need is to build up the expertise and the ability to be able to do things like fight fires. And you do that by raising the general funds that are available for that kind of thing all year round, rather than just kind of a project here and a project there that comes and goes, and the expertise comes and goes.
Yeah, because all of it will be fixed term contracts.
Next question.
The projected deficit over the next X years is several $7 billion. How much is the interest the government's paying on that? And then, so that must be great. But also, if it's $1 billion, where is Tasmania ever going to pay that debt back? It shouldn't, therefore, we're always paying interest. Yeah,
it's a good question. So the Tasmanian government borrows, like all governments, at a super low rate. So I think they're borrowing at about 3.5% at the moment. But the debt and the deficits are fairly large. Ultimately, the best way to handle deficits is actually to grow the economy. So it depends on what you're spending the money on, if that makes sense. So, I mean, people don't think that going into debt to buy a house is a bad idea. But if you're going into debt to go on holidays, that might not be a great idea. So it depends on where you spend the money. Are you improving the capacity of Tasmania to expand and grow, and therefore be able to pay that debt back within, and then some? Or are you kind of just wasting it and frittering it away? And so it's not so much, economists don't necessarily get so much upset about the size of the debt. It's what you're actually doing with the money that you're borrowing. That's the really important thing.
There's a gentleman in the middle at the back.
I just wanted to ask if you could paraphrase audience questions when you're responding.
Oh, sure. No
Sure.
problem.
Thank you.
The last one was about debt and deficit, in case you. Another gentleman up the back.
I guess this one's more for you, Thirza. There's the allocation for the 52 extra maximum security cells, beds, whichever way you want to put it. But there's no line items for a northern prison. Does that mean that going into the forward estimates, that's in the numbers?
Yeah, I noticed this, and I can't answer it because we need to ask that question. So you might know better whether it hasn't been allocated or whether because it is missing. Maybe they're getting truthful about their ability to actually deliver that. But we did notice that. Yeah, so there is some investment in justice, but again, I think it's really piecemeal and really small. And that while there's some investment in a 52-bed facility at TPS, and like prison numbers are, the highest they've ever been, right? There's very little investment about the support that's needed around that. Like I think it was 5 therapeutic people to come in. So, I think that's what's always missing from this budget is they have this government is you have these policies and then there's no commitment to the resources, and they're not just for that one group, but all of the ancillary roles that go around that in the justice system. Meg might be able to answer that.
Oh no, I was just going to follow on from it actually, because I didn't see much in there either to progress the youth detention facilities that are supposed to replace Ashley next year. And it looked like maybe $10 million was there across some period of time, but I'm not sure that's been enough for two. In fact, I think their proposal says multiple facilities, bail and then also detention. So
Yeah, I saw 10 million as well. But I don't know, I'd be interested in your reflection over the next few days. But when I read it, there's a lot of statements and not a lot of details that you would sort of expect and that we've seen previously. So there's kind
that's
of,
what estimates is for.
yeah, well, you'll have fun with that.
Yes, I will.
Bit more transparency in that part of the process. Anyone else got a question? Oh, yeah. The lady in the
Look,
blue.
I'm really concerned about our health system. And it would appear that in the budget, they're just talking about infrastructure like a helicopter place in Launceston. Well, if we don't have doctors and nurses and hospitals, how good does it have a helicopter that can transport people? Unless I missed something.
So that's a question about, it's been billed as a health budget.
Yes.
And is it really, and are we getting enough money to employ the health professionals that we actually desperately need in the state? Is it?
I think it's like a Rockcliffe special for the last few budgets. There's so much capital investment, and look at what we've opened, and then there's no staff. Like in previous budgets, like we've actually seen some investments, and then we've gone and talked to our members, and it turns out that like it's not extra money, it's just renewal of like fixed term contracts. So yeah, you're exactly right. It is there's a big hole in this budget, and it's shaped like a worker. So you know that's the issue, is that we will not have workers in place to actually deliver on some of these things. And every single commitment in a budget needs workers behind it, whether it's delivering grants or delivering healthcare. And instead we're going to have $3 million worth of efficiency dividends.
Yeah, and the funding kind of bears that out because it's quite strange. So next year you're going to have a 9% increase in health funding, which is a fair increase in health funding. The year after that, it's going to be a 4% increase. So, you know, it's dropped by a half already, like the growth in it has fallen already. And 4% is about average, but then it falls to about 1.2, 1.3% for the following years, which again suggests that nothing's permanent. It's kind of just an initial hit, and then it just tapers away to almost nothing. And as I said, like if health funding is growing at 1% and your inflation rate's 3-4%, and your population's growing at 0.5%, then you really need to be growing the funding by about 4% just to stay still. And so, you know, 1.3, 1.4% is well below that just to kind of tread water.
Health inflation is more like 8%.
Yeah, it's higher. Yeah, I think, and that's what just boggles me around this budget. Like the key planks of it that we're all supposed to celebrate are that we are like maybe slightly investing more in areas that are increasing in demand.
Evie, I'm not sure if we can ask them to pipe down for that, but they've been quite rowdy. There are some spaces at the front. If people at the back are having trouble hearing, you're welcome to come closer. Leon, go ahead.
I can't believe no one's asked the stadium. So here's the question. How has the stadium been treated in the budget? We know it's going to cost a lot of money. How has it actually been treated in terms of how the money will feed through to it?
In case anyone didn't hear that, it's how will the stadium be treated in the budget? But I think
Yeah, so it's an investment, or most of it's an investment. There is some some money on high performance as well associated with that. But most of so I think the government is committed to 375 million over outside of the forward estimates, and almost all of that will be inside the forward estimates. But what's interesting is sometimes the budget can be sadly poetic in that homelessness is a huge issue. The cost of housing is a huge issue. And the government's planning to spend money on building 10,000 homes. And that actually comes out at $373 million, which is almost exactly the same as what they're planning to spend on the stadium at $375 million. So we know basically that the stadium is worth about 10,000 homes. And you know, I mean, the more you spend, like Tasmania can fund whatever it wants. I mean, you know, we're a rich country, but we can't fund everything we want. Everything comes at an opportunity cost. And if you spend 375 million on a stadium, that means you've got less funding on other things. And in this case, 10,000 homes is roughly what it's worth.
No.
Can I follow up on the stadium?
Yes.
So you were talking about funding before, and Thirza, you were talking about something, so the funding actually came in, I think you said from 2026 on, so that's after the next state election. So is some of the funding for the stadium, if you're looking at it with a political lens, sort of front loaded, so that we'll have the skeleton of the stadium before they're at an election in 2025? Like, is that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So over the next 4 years, I think about 270 million of the stadium is happening over the next sort of 3-4 years, and the rest of it is obviously a year or two after that. And of course, looking at the contract, that's probably the bare minimum that you're going to spend on that stadium, rather than what you're actually going to spend on that stadium. Can I just say the AFL and the federal government got a great deal?
Yeah.
Kudos to them. And Tasmania will pick up any kind of overruns at all.
I think the thing I would add about the stadium is that the Premier was really clear that we could do both, that we could walk and chew gum, that we could have investment in capital works like the stadium, and it would not come at a cost of investment in public services and growing demand. And I don't think you can actually say that in this budget. Like, he has named up $300 million efficiency dividend. You know, there's not much money for housing. So I think like that, he's failed on that front.
Go ahead.
Matt, you touched on housing before. Just wondering what else is in the budget about housing, if anything.
Anything else on housing?
Yeah, so there's a whole grab bag of small stuff. Everything from domestic violence funding to help with homelessness. The big part of it is that 10,000 new homes. But there's over the whole period, there's about $1.5 billion, and that's not all new money. Some of that's governments love to heap stuff that they've already announced before in. All governments do that. But looking at the new funding, it's mostly that 10,000, and plus a heap of much smaller amounts of money, sort of tens of millions or millions rather than hundreds of millions, in a whole heap of other sort of services to help people who are homeless or fleeing domestic violence or those kind of issues.
Nowhere near enough.
No,
No.
it's not gonna fix the problem. We've spent decades really stuffing the housing market up, and at this point, you're going to need a large kind of injection, a large change in order to fix it, or it's just going to gradually keep getting worse. Sorry, economists, we're known as the dismal science. There's a reason for that. There's a reason we don't get invited to parties, right?
But I think it's worse than that, isn't it? Because I think we need hope around housing, and we needed something that was inspiring and inspirational, and there's just nothing like that in here. Like, we really need to be pulling out all the stops, and, you know, doing the things that used to work, doing the things that we could try and being innovative, and there's nothing.
Well, the announcement that they have made, that they've made a thing of, is putting more money into landlords' pockets. And I can say that as a landlord, it's a terrible thing to do. Rather than, we could put more pressure into the private rental market with the government topping up rents in the private rental market to landlords. Instead of putting a vacant tax levy in place, instead of letting councils regulate short stay accommodation, instead of those two things which would put more properties into the private rental market, they're just putting more money into landlord pockets and making the private rental market more competitive with government money.
And even then, I think it's like, it's short change. Like, it's a pilot.
It's absolutely, it's tiny.
Yeah.
Tiny.
No, this is a conversation, so thank you. Any
Can I just clarify? Sorry. just on the back of that, can I just clarify if that's regarding the Commonwealth rent insurance, or actually a Tasmanian separate?
No, they've announced a new program, similar to one they've already had in place, where essentially, if you're a landlord with a property, now the government can take the lease and rent it at an affordable level to someone on a low income and top it up with state money to give you the market rent. So as a landlord, you still get market rent.
Yeah.
It's topped up with state government money. But again, it doesn't do anything to dampen rents, doesn't do anything to put extra properties back into the market. It's a pat on the back to landlords. It's another way that landlords can have higher rents guaranteed, pretty much.
Yeah,
What's the name of that program, sorry?
The one that they've had in place, which is similar for a while, is called the Private Rental Incentive Scheme. But this is a new version of that. It's an even more streamlined version of that now, and I can't remember what lovely name they've called it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, traditionally, if you go back in time in Australia in the post-war period, the time when home ownership rates rose the most and quite dramatically, and housing affordability was its lowest, was when the state governments were building masses of public housing and the federal was funding them to do it. And you might think, well, I'm never going to be in public housing because I'll never qualify. But everybody benefits from public housing, because if they build more public housing, then some of the people showing up at those rental who are competing with everybody in order to get those limited rental properties, they're not going to be there. So it actually lowers the cost of housing for everybody, because it adds supply to the market. But it's not complicated. You don't need like these kind of weird, complicated schemes where you have, top-up payments and, higher depreciation rates and more withholding tax. And if your eyes are glazing over, that's the point. The point is they'll do anything except fund public housing directly, which is really weird that they don't want to own houses, because almost everybody in Australia thinks owning a house is a good idea, except for the government, who incidentally borrow at the lowest interest rate, far lower than you or I could borrow at. So it's a most bizarre situation.
But I think it continues a trend in this budget about that, like, government isn't there to deliver services, it's there to kind of fund others to deliver services. And I think in housing, we have to get back to the basics, which is public housing. And I think we need to go a bit further, right? Like, we don't have any control over when houses being built, right? And Queensland has an actual workforce, and I think some of the community housing groups here are building their own workforce, so they have some more control over that. The other thing we need to do is take away the kind of tax, the privatisation tax between federal government and state, where if you're in community and social housing, you get rent assistance, and if you're in public housing, you don't, because that is a massive incentive to sell public housing off, and it has. So, public housing is a basic human right, and the state should provide it, not just kind of fund other people to provide it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just wondering how far the Reserve Bank's adding to the prices in public housing by deliberately trying to reduce inflation and make things worse for everybody.
How much is the Reserve Bank adding to the problem?
Yeah, so the Reserve Bank is obsessed with inflation. In its mandate, what it has to do with its monetary policy, which is increasing or decreasing interest rates, is it's supposed to maintain full employment and currency stability, which includes inflation. But it kind of ignores the full employment side of it, and it just obsesses about inflation. And at the moment, the RBA bizarrely believes that the unemployment rate is too low. And so what they're actively doing at the moment is trying to increase the unemployment rate. And the federal budget papers and the Tasmanian budget papers both show that they'll succeed. They're both showing that the unemployment rate will go back up to what the RBA wants it at, which is 4.5%. And the reason the RBA wants an unemployment rate of 4.5% is it believes that right now workers have too much bargaining power, their wages are rising too quickly, and that is adding to inflation. And the only way to stop that terrible, terrible thing is for them to create more unemployed people so they have less bargaining power. And so right now, if a government came along with a policy that managed to reduce unemployment, all the RBA would do would be increase interest rates even more. So they're kind of adding to the problem. And the really bizarre part about it all is that the type of inflation that's caused this massive increase in inflation is not that kind of demand side workers bargaining. It's actually supply side. So most of it originates overseas. So if the RBA puts interest rates up, that doesn't lower the world price of oil. It doesn't lower the world price of gas. It doesn't fix the supply bottlenecks, of people shipping stuff around the world. And some of the supply, even the domestic kind of supply constraints are around, iceberg lettuces are suddenly expensive or potatoes are suddenly expensive. Well, increasing interest rates is not going to change the weather, and it's not going to mean that suddenly veggies or fruit and veggies are going to be cheaper. So it's kind of, but the problem is they've got this kind of one tool, interest rates, and so they look around and they see inflation and they're just beating away with it because they've got nothing else that they can do, and they're kind of reluctant to admit that it's not really helping the situation at all.
There's also only ever one narrative in the economic world, and that's like whatever the problem, it's like workers that have to pay. It's always the workers. Workers can't have a pay rise because we're in the GFC. Workers can't have a pay rise because inflation is going up. It's always the same answer.
There's never a good time for workers' wages to go up, according to a lot of economists.
Who's next? There's another topic I was expecting to hear about. Oh, go ahead, up the back.
Yeah, just on the infrastructure. Does the budget reveal anything about the Commonwealth contribution to Macquarie Point and the stadium?
Commonwealth contribution to the stadium at Macquarie Point.
Another one. Is there anything in there about Marinus Link?
Marinus Link. That's the one I was waiting for.
Yes and yes. So on Marinus Link, there isn't funding because there hasn't been a final investment decision, which won't happen until December 2024.
Next year.
Yeah. And their Treasury is basically saying there's $6.7 billion for Marinus and the other infrastructure in northern part of Tasmania, and the Battery of the Nation stuff. But Treasury is kind of concerned. They actually sounded a warning, and they basically said, look, the final investment decision is not till the end of next year, but the government might actually have to spend money before that for the pre-works, before they've actually made a decision on whether or not they want to do it. And Treasury is going, that's a bit kind of risky, which is a bit odd. On the point, I heard just today that so the money's not in the budget in the sense that it's a line item, but the budget does talk about the fact that the federal government is going to put in 240 million. But I heard just today from Meg that that's actually not a grant, that's actually a loan.
It's GST money.
Yeah, so what it's not a loan in the traditional sense. Basically, what the Commonwealth government is going to do is over time they're going to reduce Tasmania's GST payments by that amount. So it's effectively like a loan. It's basically a bring forward of the GST money. So they're not really giving anything. All they're doing is kind of lending it to you, and then you'll pay it back over time.
The stadium will all be ours.
Yeah.
All of it. All the overruns, all the federal money.
And if it doesn't make money, the government will pay even more.
If people don't shop to watch, the government will pay it more.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Are you saying that the stadium won't make money?
If it doesn't,
It's not
then
me who's saying
it's the
government
tax.
is saying that themselves in their business case.
Yeah, so it's not that it won't make money. If it doesn't, then the Tasmanian taxpayers will foot the bill of whatever the loss is.
But just to be clear though, the government's business case says it won't make money. Yeah.
It can't possibly make money.
No, it can't.
If they're banking on 44 major events a year, it's one every other, well, more than one every other week. But we don't get the crowds. It won't work, surely.
And that's what the contract has, that clause, because the people running the stadium don't want to take the loss, so they've got to work out who's going to take that loss, and they've negotiated that it will be the Tasmanian taxpayers.
There's a question from
Oh,
people
yes,
joining
we have got
online.
people online,
Yeah.
so thanks, Evie.
So Darren asks if there is anything to incentivise the uptake of electric vehicles in the budget.
Was there anything in the budget to incentivise the uptake of EVs, electric vehicles?
I didn't see anything, no. Nothing that I saw.
No, might have to take that one on notice, Darren.
If there was, the government wasn't talking particularly loudly about it. It might be buried somewhere, like the budget papers are kind of massive. It might be buried in there somewhere, but they're not gloating about it or they're not highlighting it, which suggests that it's probably not there.
They've funded those projects before and they're finished, don't you know?
Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Thirza spoke a lot about worker shortages. Sorry. Thirza spoke earlier about worker shortages. Was there anything in the budget for skills development or TAFE places?
Oh, there was something about TAFE. The question is around skills development and money for TAFE and...
There's very little. So there is some money for teachers, for retention of teachers, and there is money for TAFE, but it looks like infrastructure money mostly around investing in. There is some federal, obviously, money for TAFE, but no real significant investment from what I can see into TAFE. And then it's not named up at all about how we will develop the workforce. So it's entirely missing from the budget. There is, though, some money for community sectors and private industry to build their capability.
There is some explicit mention, though, of construction workforce initiatives for TAFE to develop construction workforce. That's definitely mentioned very particularly, and it'd be silly if they didn't mention that, wouldn't it? Given our roads and stadiums, our road
And I think there's some money for some community organisations around professional development as well. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I make another point? Yes. Because I think it's pertinent to TAFE and also in the housing space, because in the last 2 years the government have taken TAFE and put it separate to government even more, and they've taken what used to be the housing department, the housing Tasmania, and they've made it a separate entity. Both those things are less easy to see now in the state budget and less easy to scrutinise. Wait till other scrutiny opportunities like GBE opportunities and things to properly investigate how the money's being spent in those entities. So they've really put them at arm's length and kind of breaks up the opportunity to hold the government responsible.
Oh, it absolutely does. So, the 2 hours I spent, it was really difficult to kind of piece all that together. But I think what's even more disappointing is like both of those decisions to abandon DCT and to move TAFE to Fair Work is just like, well, we're just changing the machinery of government. And then in this budget, we're not even giving them that much more money, right? So, that's not going to resolve the problem that we face. Like, yes, it might look like government has done something, and it now means that everything is at arm's length from government, but it is not going to resolve the issues that we're facing. So I think we're definitely going to have to keep watch of that one, but it's not looking good. I can't see that they've got the resources they need to actually make a material difference to both our skills development and to our housing situation.
But they've got skills-based boards running them, Thirza, so all is well. We can just all relax and sleep well at night.
Yeah.
And I thought budgets were supposed to be about transparency.
I've got a suggestion for change in the budget.
Go on.
But I think budgets are rage-inducing, right? Like, only slightly second to budget estimates, where like public sector workers go in with like all of this information, and then it's like, unless you ask the exact question, you do not get the answer. And poor public sector workers are like, working all the hours under the night, and then the minister's like, thank God none of the information came out. Anyway,
it's all about transparency.
But when you read the budget papers, it's pretty difficult to actually see what's happening. Like, unless like you take your budget papers for the last 5 years and you sit down, we do need more information. Like, what's been cut? What is it? Like, 5 billion. What does that mean? Like, is it a 2% increase? Is it a 10% decrease from the last year? Like, we need a much better signalling. It's not how you would read a budget when you're in an organisation. Like, you would know what's up and what's down. And we just get these kind of moments in time that are really difficult to tell you anything. I think that would increase transparency.
They could just release the folders. Come on.
Oh, yeah, budget estimates, they could. Yeah, definitely.
public servants
You can't
spend
cut the
3
back-
months
you
getting
can't-
those folders ready. Just make them public, eh?
Yeah. But you need a back line for that, Meg.
Oh,
Are there any states that are doing it better?
Are there any states that are doing it better?
Like budgets.
Yeah.
That's a great question. No, I don't think so. Look, I mean, I've watched a lot of budgets over a long time, and budgets tend to becoming less transparent, not more transparent, and that's pretty much the case across the board. You know, it used to be that the budget was great because it was the one moment you got to find out what the government's true priorities were. Politicians will run around and tell you how wonderful and how important your issue is to them all day long, but the budget was the one time when they had to put a dollar amount next to how much they thought your issue, whether it was important or not. And if that amount was zero, then you knew that it wasn't important to them. That was the great thing about budgets. But you know, they're becoming less transparent, so it's becoming harder and harder to work out, well, where is the money actually going, and what really are their priorities.
So, have you ever met a budget, if you say there's never a good time for workers to get a pay rise, which I get that.
I don't agree with that, but yeah.
No. Sorry, there's oh yeah, that's right, I've been outed. No, I meant that's the narrative, right? Like, there's never a good time. But I guess on the other side, have you ever met a budget that you've liked? Like, Matt, think back to a time where you've sat at something like this and gone, now that's a good budget. That's got some great stuff in it.
I didn't mind the federal budget, right? Like, yes, because it felt like there were decisions made around around priorities and opportunities. And not everybody was entirely happy, and not everyone should be happy, right? But it did feel like there was a plan and an idea about where they were going. And there were some choices made, and they didn't back away from the choices. I thought that, you know, and also I think it was a budget that actually put the workforce at the centre of it, getting women back into the workforce, lifting the wages of early educators and aged care. Because the reality is you can't run public sector, you can't run public services or even services or unlock, you know, the efficiency or our productivity as a country unless we've got people in jobs. So I didn't mind that one.
Yeah.
But then they've all been pretty awful from before that, so, you know, whatever.
I think I'm deeply, deeply cynical. No, there isn't. So, look, I agree that budget was a step in the right direction, but the number of times I have said, oh yes, that's a step in the right direction, is truly depressing. And so, was that a good budget? I don't think we'll know until the next budget and the budget after that. Because if this is the beginning of going in the right direction, then we should continue on the journey. If, on the other hand, the first step is, all right, I've done something about that, and now I'm going to go over and do something completely different and ignore what I've done, then you won't know until the next budget and the budget after that. And, you know, I mean, as I said, budget's a priority, you know, are about priorities. And at the moment, I'm really keen to know whether the federal government wants to allow the stage 3 tax cuts to come in. I mean, if you're talking about priorities, that's $20 billion a year, $20 billion a year, half of which goes to people earning more than $180,000 a year. You know, if you want to talk about priorities, that doesn't seem like a Labor priority to me, but they seem happy to kind of have that one go through. So it's difficult to listen to the Treasurer go, we can't even afford to fund good ideas when he's handing out $20 billion to rich people.
Yeah, no, I agree on that. Just hopefully might change their way.
Hopefully.
With the housing crisis, you mentioned 10,000 homes in the price of the stadium, which worked out quite about 40,000 a home. But how can these homes even be built when there isn't the workforce, as far as I know, to do it? And apart from that, there's the supply chain difficulties of actually getting the material with which to build the house. So, if you have any comment on the seemingly insurmountable difficulty of actually getting housing built?
Yeah, look, I mean, yeah, so the question is, you know, there's this money for 10,000 new homes, and more broadly across the whole of Australia, there's more money for these extra homes, but how are they going to be built if we don't have the workers to do it? I mean, there's actually a solution to all of this, right? But unfortunately, it requires a large change. And the solution is that the government could set up an organisation whose job it was to build public housing over decades, right? So you set up. Then you could recruit young people and have them as apprentices. You could train them up. You could recruit your own workforce so that you weren't relying on the private market and whether or not it was rushing off and building big infrastructure projects over here or lots of, housing for other people. And then you would actually then have you wouldn't have those supply chain issues because you'd have the workforce and you'd be a regular purchaser effectively and builder of housing. And that's what they used to do. And if you wanted to fund that, you could fund it through changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax discount. That'd give you $10 million a year to put into this kind of thing. So, but if you just want to kind of tinker around at the edges and throw a little bit, you're always going to have that problem of, well, not only is it sustainable, is it going to last, but also where are you going to find the workers? And if the economy shifts and suddenly there's more demand for these kind of workers over here, then does the government miss out? Do they have to bid up even higher? Do they have to spend more? You get all those problems.
But also a really good example of that would solve our problem around building houses, but it would also solve our problem around training apprentices. Sometimes when governments choose to actually get into direct service delivery, it's not just about the outcome, it's about the kind of broader public policy and all the other bits that come with that. And I think that's the bit that we're missing. We've got to go back to basics.
Go ahead.
You said it was 370 million, 10,000
373, yeah.
There's going to be a serious cost. I don't think you get 10,000 and there seems to be a problem throughout Australia. Costings are always very low. Almost 70% across the lot of days. So why is it so whether it's military equipment or whatever? The costing is always way lower.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, why is it that government projects always, particularly infrastructure projects, whether it's defence or housing or whatever it happens to be, always seem to run over? I think it's because governments tend to, these days, go in and out. So there's a couple of things happening. Firstly, there's a whole load of consulting happening in the public service. We've kind of hollowed out that expertise. So we don't really have public servants who actually understand these projects deeply, that can actually work out and look at people who are presenting them with costings and go, oh, that looks a bit awful. That's not going to be it. I don't believe your numbers, and can then kind of go back and push back and go, well, actually, why are you saying that? That looks terrible. That looks like it's too little. Is this going to run over? And also because the government kind of basically just comes in and out. So they're kind of doing little bits and pieces here and there, rather than kind of working out what we need the most and kind of getting in for the long haul. I mean, if you got in for the long haul, then you would just learn from doing the construction and you would find that those kind of cost overruns would vanish. Even if they were initially there, they would vanish over time because you'd understand what you're actually doing in a sustained way. So it's kind of about this kind of bitsy in and out sort of stuff and a kind of hollowing out of the public service.
Yeah, and I think the key thing when we look at workforces or public sector workforces is even if you hollow them out, they don't disappear, they just go somewhere else, right? So the federal public sector has had a staffing cap and an efficiency limit for how long? And then we recently learned that it has a shadow workforce of consultants that's 37% of the workforce. That's massive, right? The work doesn't disappear. So, I think you're exactly right. And also, if you don't have the expertise, you can't check the contracts, but you also can't check the product that you're getting. So, we have some architects who always talk about, well, sometimes they try to sell us a bridge that's basically going to last 50,000 years. It's it doesn't need to be that strong. Yeah, you've got to have expertise in the public sector to check the work It's just a core, and if you want like an example of when that doesn't work, we can see that with employment services. Like we've entirely privatised that out, and it needs to be renationalised.
Any other questions? Oh, another one up the back.
Just going back to you made the point earlier about the impact of public housing on house prices. Is that an explanation as to why the current government is not taking action because of the tear up?
Oh, you're as cynical as I am. I like it. Look, I mean, look. It's really weird. Oh, I'm getting feedback. It's really weird. Menzies, you know, the founder of the Liberal Party, thought that home ownership, everybody should own their own house. Why? Because he was in the middle of an era where communism was a problem and there was anarchy, and he thought that if you owned a part in your suburb, you were less likely to throw Molotov cocktails in your suburb, right? So he was doing it for entirely conservative reasons. And so he basically set about increasing home ownership rates, and he was very successful. But the modern Liberal Party or coalition have basically, and to a certain extent Labor Party, have basically changed it and made, rather than housing being about a kind of utility, a shelter, a place where you raise a family, they turned it into an investment. And it's a way of making money. It's a way of building your nest egg. It's a way of saving for retirement. It's a way of setting yourself up. And I think we need to get away from, like, there are plenty of ways you can make money. You know, there are lots of different investments you can make. If people overinvest in the stock market, stock prices go up, and eventually there's a bit of a bubble, and some people, take a loss. But nobody lives in stock prices, right? Whereas if house prices go up, that actually has real-world impacts on the way people live. And I think we need to get away from this idea that housing is an investment. It's a way of making money. It shouldn't be about a way of making money. It should be about housing people and giving people security. That needs to change. If we want to fix this problem, our attitude towards housing has to reverse back to the Menzies era. Sorry?
They also did rent controls in the post-year wars.
Oh, yeah.
Rent controls were up to 10 years after the war.
Yep.
At a federal level.
Any other questions? I think we might be fighting a losing battle with the party around the corner. If there's no other questions, I think we should thank our panellists so much. And just before I let you go, I'd just like to remind you the Australia Institute is a charity, and we love getting you all together for free, but it's not free for us to put this on. So if you are able to, there's a box you can chuck some money in on the bar, or you can make a donation online anytime. Fully tax deductible, and it's near the end of the tax year, so intense, isn't it? I should probably wrap it up there then. Thank you all very much for coming, and thanks again to our panelists. And thanks to Evie as well, who's our Anne Cantor Fellow, Evie Simpson. Thank you for your